I'd hoped to get feedback to you from the midterm exam, but to be honest with you, I haven't finished reviewing the exam yet. So we'll get the scores posted the next day or so, and we'll be returning the exams to you on Wednesday. So on Wednesday, we'll give you I'll give you some of this feedback. One of the persisting problems when you're talking about consciousness, as we've said from the outset, is how is it that you're going to objectively study people's subjective, private, internal mental states? Okay? How are you going to do something public and scientific with something that is private and personal? And one of the ways that we've discovered to do that is to try to find a way to tie people's internal subjective states to the environment, to stimulus conditions. Another way is to try to tie people's internal subjective states to internal conditions, that is, what's going on in their nervous system. It's hard enough when you've got when you're trying to look at somebody's subjective mental state that they can report on. At least you can have some hope of linking that to the environment or to physiology. But we saw another version of this problem when we started talking about unconscious mental states. If we say somebody is unconsciously perceiving something or has an unconscious memory, they can't even report on it. How are we supposed to study that scientifically? Well, we figured out how to do that too when we looked at procedures for distinguishing between automatic and controlled mental processes, and for distinguishing between explicit and implicit memories or percepts or whatever. This same problem rears its ugly head again when we take up the problem of altered states of consciousness. Suppose we have reason to think that a person's in an altered state of consciousness, they've taken a drug or they're dreaming or whatever. How are we going to study those things scientifically? And it turns out the answer is pretty much the same, by trying to tie their self-reports of their mental states to either conditions in the environment or to things that are going on in their nervous system. This methodology was made very clear in an important paper published 50 years ago now by Johann Stoive, who's a psychologist at the University of Colorado, and Joe Camilla, who is a longtime psychologist over here at UCSF, who employed a logic of converging operations in order to try to define various altered states of consciousness. And the general idea here is the more evidence you have that converges on the fact that a person's in an altered state of consciousness, the more convinced you can be that the person actually is in an altered state of consciousness. So what kind of evidence are we looking for? Well, the first thing is you might look for an induction procedure, something that's happening to the subject that might create an altered state of consciousness. To take an elementary example, maybe ingest one of those funny pills, okay? Or takes some other kind of drug, or takes a drink of alcohol. Or in the case of hypnosis, maybe there's a hypnotist who's going through a hypnotic induction procedure. Some kind of situation where that is intended or designed to produce an altered state of consciousness. The second criterion, or the second class of criteria we have, are the person's reports of subjective experiences. The person says, oh, I'm high now, or I'm drunk now, or I'm hypnotized now, or when you say to somebody, are you asleep? And they say yes, or no, or whatever, that's a subjective report of an altered state of consciousness. There may also be changes in their overt behavior. Hypnotized subjects will engage in, say, post-hypnotic behaviors of various kinds. Or, as we'll see in a minute, patients in a coma will not engage in certain kinds of behaviors that they're supposed to engage in. And then finally, we have some kind of physiological response or physiological correlate. We can assume that, at least at some level, there are changes in neurophysiology that are correlated with these changes in consciousness. And Stoiva and Kamiya simply made an almost logical point that the more of this kind of evidence you've got, the more likely it is that a person really is in an altered state of consciousness. If there is an induction procedure that's followed by certain kinds of subjective self-reports, these are accompanied by certain kinds of changes, relevant changes in overt behavior. And when you look at the person's brain, you see that their brains are doing something interesting. Well, then you know that they're in an altered state of consciousness. You don't need all four. You can do it with 2. You can do it with 3. You don't need any particular one. You can do it with any 2, any 3, or any 4. But the point is that where these 4 kinds of features converge, there you can be pretty certain that the person is, in fact, in an altered state of consciousness. Now, what we're going to do this week, today and Wednesday, is to talk about particular class of altered states of consciousness where consciousness is altered by being lost. The person isn't conscious, okay? And we'll talk about how it is that we know that this is the case and what are the various kinds of things that can happen in these cases. And so what we're talking about is a set of clinical disruptions of consciousness, the kinds of disruptions of consciousness that are seen by neurologists in hospitals, in emergency rooms, and sometimes in other circumstances as well. To begin with, the traditional classification boils down to 3 of these clinical disruptions of consciousness. The first of these, one that's getting a lot of attention now in football and soccer and other kinds of sports contexts, is a concussion, which is defined as a temporary disturbance of consciousness. Note, it's a disturbance of consciousness. I'll talk more about that in a second. That results from a closed head injury. What's a closed head injury? It's a closed head injury that doesn't involve a wound that spills blood, okay? So you're in a car and you have a head-on collision. You hit your head against the windshield or the dashboard. You're very likely to suffer a concussion. You're a football player on the field and somebody tackles you or blocks you particularly badly, and you're going to experience a concussion. But there's no blood spilled on the field, at least not usually. That's a closed head injury. At the next level, a concussion is a temporary loss of consciousness. People recover from concussions. It may take a greater or lesser period of time, but they do recover from these. But in stupor, you have a more chronic loss of consciousness where this persists for some period of time, like more than 15 minutes, half an hour or so. But still, the person is responsive to some kinds of stimulation, especially very vigorous stimulation where you poke them a bunch of times or slap them across the face or something like that, or the painful stimulation. And then finally, we have coma, which is, again, a chronic loss of consciousness, one that persists for an appreciable period of time. But in the case of coma, as distinct from stupor, there is a failure of the person to arouse even after being subjected to what the clinicians call vigorous or painful stimuli. Okay, so this is the first 3 groupings that we've got of these clinical disorders of consciousness, and all of these have been studied more or less thoroughly in terms of their behavioral correlates, their physiological substrates, and so on. Let's look just for a moment. I added this slide again because of a lot of current interest in concussion. Let's look at how concussions are defined. We're talking about a temporary disturbance of consciousness, typically one that lasts more than 5 minutes. Okay, less than 5 minutes, clinicians are less likely to say you've actually suffered a concussion. But what can happen here is that even after you've recovered consciousness after a concussion, you may still experience some level of amnesia, an amnesia that can last for half a day or so. Typically, this is an anterograde amnesia. After a person's concussed, he won't remember the things that happened for some period of time after the concussion occurred. Sometimes there's a retrograde amnesia as well. that covers the moments to minutes before the concussion occurred. And clinically, we could grade these in terms of the grade 1, grade 2, grade 3. In grade 1, the person will show some confusion, be disoriented for time, place, and person, won't know where he is, won't know who he is, won't recognize the examiner or whatever. But there's just confusion. There's no actual loss of consciousness. And in a grade 1 concussion, you get this confusion that lasts for less than 15 minutes. It's more or less an arbitrary clinical definition. Grade 2 concussion, same kinds of features, but the confusion persists for more than 15 minutes. A grade 3 concussion is associated with any kind of loss of consciousness. There's a famous study of these kinds of mild concussions, grade 1 and grade 2 concussions, that was actually conducted with college football players on the field. One of the things that happens if you're a college football player is you tend to get concussed. You also tend to get your limbs broken. Doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen. In this particular study, these investigators who happen to be sports medicine people compared psychological consequences of a mild concussion, what's known in football parlance as the ding, to other players who weren't concussed but who, say, maybe suffered a fracture of an arm or a leg. What they did was, as soon as the player was injured, they ran out on the field and they conducted an examination right there before he was put on the stretcher or helped all the field. And then the player was brought back to the training room or sometimes to the hospital. And at that point, they asked the patient, the players, number of more thorough questions about memory. Did they recall the examination that had occurred on the field? Many times the players don't do that. Okay, so that's the anterograde amnesia coming in. Or they might ask them if they remember being hit or remember what play was in progress. That would be a measure of, say, retrograde amnesia. What they observed in all these subjects was that there was no loss of consciousness, okay? But still, the patients were disoriented. They didn't know where they were. They didn't know what had happened to them. They might not recognize their coach or whatever. And then there was a loss of memory that occurred within minutes of the ding. The moral of this story is that if you ever experience a closed head injury, don't get right back up and do something, right? Get some medical attention. Give yourself a break for a little while, because these things sometimes take a while to build up. And you can actually get yourself in quite a bit of trouble. Okay, let's turn to the most dramatic of these losses of consciousness, which is coma. We talked about this a little bit before in the context of the neural correlates of consciousness. Here you have an actual loss of consciousness on the part of the person. And these comas are diagnosed behaviorally in terms of a number of behaviors that the patients display, or rather don't display. One of these is that there's no communication with the patient. The patient doesn't seem to respond to spoken commands or questions or instructions, certainly doesn't initiate any verbal communication. Moreover, these comatose patients don't respond to any kind of stimulation.